mevrouw de rector magnificus, mevrouw de voorzitter, geacht faculteitsbestuur, zeer gewaardeerde toehoorders. In 2017, when I was awarded the European Research Council starting grant to carry out global tax governance research project, Professor Frans van Istendale, tax scholar who recently passed away, told me that the problem of global tax governance was so complex that if I manage to find a solution, I will not only get the Nobel Prize of Economy, but also the Nobel Prize of Peace. Not sure if I will get any Nobel Prize, but I took the challenge, and this inaugural lecture is in his honor. Since February 2018, when I started my GloveTaxGov project, I have been searching for the conditions under which a model of global tax governance can be feasible and legitimate for both developed and developing countries. But the question that I want to address here is why it matters. Why do we discuss global tax governance, legitimacy, and inclusiveness? What has changed in international taxation that makes that nowadays we cannot address taxation without addressing the political dimension of it? International political developments. In 2016, Thomas Rixen and Peter Disch, in their book, Global Tax Governance, What is Wrong with It and How to Fix It, defined global tax governance consisting of the set of institutions governing issues of taxation that involve cross-border transactions. This definition implies that global tax governance need not, but could involve a full or partial shift of the power to tax, that is, the right to impose taxes on citizens, to the international level. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, with the political mandate of the G20, have introduced international tax standards, first a standard of exchange of information, thereafter the BEPS project, including 4 minimum standards, 10 best practices, and 1 multilateral instrument to tackle tax avoidance by multinationals. In my view, when addressing the introduction of these international tax standards from the perspective of global tax governance, and using the definition of Rixen and Disch, it means that there is a shift of the power to tax from countries to international organizations, the OECD and the political forum, the G20. The OECD claimed that they did so with the political mandate of the G20, and by inviting non-OECD, non-G20 countries to participate in these initiatives, developed and developing countries will benefit since exchange of information and less tax avoidance will raise more revenue by countries. This revenue could be used for public services, health, education, but also to contribute to fairness of taxation vis-à-vis citizens who were suffering from the consequences of the financial crisis. In short, more transparency meant more money for countries to overcome the problems created by the financial crisis. Since then, we have the standard of exchange of information when we have 160 tax jurisdictions, and we also have the BEPS project with 143 tax jurisdictions as of June 2023. Countries participating in the Global Transparency Forum and the BEPS Inclusive Forum have also agreed to be reviewed by their peers, peer review, on their commitment to these standards. However, unlike treaties, where you sign the treaty and it has an effect for both or multiple parties, the BEPS 4 minimum standards are regarded as soft law, since these standards are not binding for countries. So in principle, countries are not required to implement these standards. But they do so. Why? Some of the reasons that I have found in my research are, first, chance and necessity, technical assistance by developed countries and OECD, and twinning projects between developed and developing countries. Another reason is the expected efficacy of the law, access to information by tax administrations or multinationals. Another reason is the political, economical, and reputational incentives, commitment to the EU standard of tax good governance in trade partnership agreements to receive EU funding and to be excluded from the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions. Due to the increase of digital business prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, countries decided to address this issue. After several proposals from the OECD Secretariat, OECD, non-OECD countries, in 2021, 137 of the 141 countries belonging to the BEPS Inclusive Framework reached a political agreement to introduce measures to tax highly digitalized business, Pillar 1, and to introduce a global minimum tax rate, Pillar 2. The legitimacy of all of these political developments by the OECD, G20, and the BEPS inclusive framework has been and still is questioned by scholars, civil society, countries, regional tax organizations, and regional organizations. My research in the GloveTaxGov research project and my leading chair on tax governance investigates under what conditions the shift of power can be legitimate and feasible vis-à-vis non-OECD, non-G20 countries, including developing countries. In order to define legitimacy, I have used political science scholarship, Scharf's concept of input and output legitimacy, and Schmidt's concept of throughput legitimacy. In short, legitimacy provides for a framework to evaluate the participation and representation in decision-making, input legitimacy. The outcome being useful for all stakeholders, output legitimacy, and the process being transparent, inclusive, responsive, and open, throughput legitimacy. These questions on feasibility and legitimacy are even more relevant now, in the midst of the discussions taking place since November 2022 at the United Nations level. These discussions have been initiated by Nigeria with the support of some African countries. These countries submitted a proposal for a draft resolution at the UN Second Committee on the promotion of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation. This resolution has been approved by the General Assembly in December 2022. This resolution gives the United Nations a more important role in the setting of international tax standards. This is not the first time that efforts have been made to give importance to the United Nations. At the 2015 Addis Tax Initiative, it was proposed to give to the UN Tax Committee the status of an intergovernmental body. This proposal was rejected by some developed countries at that time due to the predominant role of the OECD in tax matters. Given the political developments and the voice raised by scholars, civil societies, and countries unilaterally or in regional settings, this new development at the United Nations could shift the decision-making process from the OECD, the G20, towards the United Nations. But of course, we have to wait and see. In my view, we need to continue engaging all stakeholders, business countries, civil society, international organizations, regional tax organizations, supranational organizations, while discussing these international political developments. The EU political developments and the EU standard of tax good governance. With the aim to play a more important role in the international tax developments vis-à-vis non-EU countries, the EU Commission has also introduced in 2008 the EU Standard of Tax Good Governance that provides for transparency, exchange of information, and fair tax competition. Since 2018, this standard also includes commitment to the BEPS for minimum standards. This standard of tax good governance is introduced in economic, trade, partnership agreements with third non-EU countries, as well as one precondition to receive EU aid and to be excluded from the blacklist of non-cooperative jurisdictions. In light of the above, my research in the GloveTaxGov research project and my chair on tax governance also investigates under what conditions the role of the EU in international tax lawmaking can be legitimate and feasible vis-à-vis non-EU countries. In 2021, I was awarded an EU Jamonet Chair to raise awareness of the use of a standard of EU tax good governance and the consequences for non-European countries, including developing countries. Receiving this Jamonet Chair shows that research can be translated into teaching. The courses that I teach at Leiden Law School also contributes to raise the awareness of the use of this standard. In my view, more research is needed on how these international and EU tax developments have been influenced by political developments, but also on how these developments can be legitimate and feasible vis-à-vis non-OECD, non-G20, non-EU countries. I have started to address these questions with my ERC GloveTaxGov project, my Jamonet Chair, and I will continue to address these questions with my chair on tax governance at Leiden Law School. Global tax governance, legitimacy and inclusiveness, why it matters. Taxation is linked to sovereignty, where countries can decide what rules are needed and how these rules are implemented. These rules are subject to the trias politicas, checks and balance between the different branches, executive, legislative, and judiciary. These rules can be domestic, national, regional, local rules. In addition, there are rules applicable to cross-border transactions, activities by non-residents, either individuals or business. In order to provide relief of double taxation regarding these cross-border activities, countries have concluded double tax treaties. However, the introduction of the standard of transparency and exchange of information as well as the BEPS project has changed this approach. By means of the former, countries were required to exchange information and to repeal their bank secrecy rules. For instance, countries such as Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Uruguay changing the rules to make exchange of information more efficient and effective. With the BEPS project, countries are also were required to introduce rules to tackle aggressive tax planning. This brings me to the title of this lecture and the questions addressed at the beginning of this lecture. I will address these questions in the following paragraphs. From legitimacy. Scholars, civil society, and countries have expressed in articles and meetings at international and regional level their concerns regarding the legitimacy of the BEPS project vis-à-vis non-OECD, non-G20 countries. Scholars and countries have also addressed issues expressed in regional consultations, issues that are outside the BEPS project, such as, for instance, the informal economy or taxation of capitals from indirect transfers. Some of these topics are being addressed by international organizations, either unilaterally, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, or in the framework of cooperation, the Platform for Collaboration on Tax. In order to address the concerns of legitimacy, the OECD created the BEPS Inclusive Framework, where countries were invited to participate as BEPS associates and to commit to the implementation of the BEPS for minimum standards. This implementation is on equal footing and subject to the consensus -1 rule. This means, then, that upon review of the implementation, the peer review of the country can be adopted even if one country does not agree with it, the -1 rule. This country can be most likely the country which is being peer reviewed. The system of peer review and consensus -1 rule was adopted based on the experience of the peer review on the standard of exchange of information. At that time, Uruguay, a country with bank secrecy, opposed to the peer review report, but the report was adopted based on the rule, consensus -1 rule. As I highlighted in 2015, non-OECD, non-G20 countries, including developing countries, needed to participate in the agenda setting of international tax standards, input legitimacy, and to benefit from these standards, output legitimacy. In my article, I concluded that there is a lack of input and output legitimacy. Later on, in a 2018 article, after the creation of the BEPS Inclusive Framework, I continued questioning the legitimacy of the BEPS for minimum standards. At that time, and still applicable, it is not yet clear whether these BEPS for minimum standards are what developing countries need. How much revenue has the implementation of the BEPS minimum standards raised for developing countries? In the 2018 article, I also concluded, and is still applicable, that the fast pace of the implementation of the BEPS for minimum standards has resulted in developing countries focusing on these standards while deviating their attention from other priorities, such as taxation of informal economy, tax evasion, digitalization of tax administration, improving taxpayer compliance, among others. The same questions on legitimacy can also be raised in respect of the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 discussions. Therefore, it is for international regional organizations and governments to find out how countries, including developing countries, can benefit from these initiatives and what needs to be done to also give a voice to developing countries. All countries should have a voice, but this also means that training and knowledge is needed so all countries can exercise that voice. To inclusiveness. In addition to legitimacy, there were all concerns from developing countries, including the fast pace of the BEPS project and the lack of resources, personal, financial, to participate effectively at the discussions by the BEPS Inclusive Framework, either at the OECD headquarters in Paris or online. Furthermore, some scholars, civil society, and think tanks have highlighted that the main role in international tax policy making should be given to the United Nations. These concerns have not been addressed with the creation of the BEPS inclusive framework, since for the BEPS project, the participation is on equal footing, but only for purposes of the implementation of the BEPS for minimum standards. And it is not clear if all countries can become a member of the BEPS inclusive framework, since it needs approval of all the other countries participating in the framework. This is the case of Cyprus, that has not been able to join the BEPS inclusive framework, but to still show its commitment to the BEPS project, Cyprus has decided to sign the BEPS multilateral instrument. Furthermore, at the start of the discussions between 2018 and 2019 of Pillar 1, it was clear that there were three positions, one from the OECD, one from the United States, and one from developing countries, G24 countries. Because no consensus was reached, the OECD Secretariat submitted a proposal end of 2019, which was a combination of the OECD and US, leaving behind the G24 developing countries proposal. In the midst of these discussions, the United States asked countries to refrain from introducing unilateral measures, such as digital service tax. And if not, the US will start Section 301 US trade investigations, which will result in trade retaliation measures. In 2020, consultations and discussions took place, but without any progress on the adoption of the OECD Secretariat proposal. However, the situation changed in 2021 with the United States Biden's presidency. The US decided to go forward with implementation of Pillar 2 and to endorse Pillar 1 OECD Secretariat proposal. This proposal was discussed at the G7, G20, and thereafter the BEPS inclusive framework. The result is the political agreement, a political statement agreed in 2021, endorsed by 137 of the 141 jurisdictions participating at the BEPS inclusive framework. Since then, the number has risen to 139, with the increase to 143 of the number of countries participating in the BEPS inclusive framework. 4 countries have not endorsed this political statement: Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Kenya. Nigeria has expressed that the political outcome is not fair, and therefore they continue with their own rules. Kenya has a digital service tax, so at that moment it was not considered by policymakers in Kenya that the country should commit to this political statement. However, in the framework of the negotiations of a trade agreement, the US has asked Kenya to repeal the digital service tax and to commit to the political outcome of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Kenya's government has recently expressed that they will follow this path. Why it matters? Even if at the time that the BEPS project, the OECD developed the BEPS inclusive framework to allow participation on equal footing, this participation is only for the purposes of implementation. So I argued back in 2015 that there was no participation on the decision-making process. Since then, so many actors have come into place, including also new standards, Pillar 1, Pillar 2, but the questions remain the same. In the following paragraphs, I will address some of these questions. The other questions, there is a QR code that you will receive at the end, and is also available with this lecture. So if the decision-making took place at the OECD level with the political mandate of the G20, have non-OECD, non-G20 countries truly participated in the decision-making process? As I have addressed in this lecture, the decision-making of the content of the BEPS project and its BEPS action was made by the OECD and the G20. In my research, I have addressed that for OECD countries, the BEPS project was an opportunity to advance in projects that were not broadly implemented, harmful tax competition, and to take the leading role in international tax matters with the OECD Secretariat and the Committee of Fiscal Affairs. This item on the agenda, topics to be addressed in the BEPS project. Even if countries wanted to participate at the OECD, they cannot, because they need to be invited by the OECD. And even if countries want to participate in the G20, it's even worse, because it's a political forum, so they cannot be invited. So they will never be part of the G20. Despite the existence of other forums for developing countries, G24, G77, these forums were not invited to take part in the decision-making process of the BEPS project. If not, is the creation of networks such as the Global Transparency Forum and the BEPS Inclusive Framework enough to justify the legitimacy of the decision-making process? Regional tax organizations, African Tax Administration Forum, ATAF, and countries in the African, Caribbean, Latin American, and Central American region have highlighted the fast pace of the implementation of the BEPS project and the need to provide equitable and effective Pillar 1, Pillar 2 rules. Regarding the BEPS project, some countries have chosen, in addition to the BEPS for minimum standards, to implement some of the BEPS best practices. But this decision has been an unilateral decision. Regarding the decision-making process, the discussions on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 within the BEPS Inclusive Framework have also shown that there is a limited participation by non-OECD, non-G20 countries in decision-making. This limited participation was also addressed by the OECD in the report to the G20 under 2021 Italian presidency. One of the recommendations of this report was the introduction of a co-chair of the BEPS Inclusive Framework, which should be from a non-OECD, non-G20 country. The question is whether the establishment of this co-chair from a developing country is enough to ensure inclusive participation of developing countries in the decision-making process. Third question. Despite the work done by the OECD and the G20 in the BEPS project and Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, should decision-making take place at the OECD level or rather at the United Nations level? And if so, how? In my view, this is the most difficult question to answer. Since the United Nations development is recent, since November 2022, and it's also difficult to answer taking into account the changes at the OECD Secretariat, mainly with respect to the position of the director of the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration. When the BEPS project started, Pascal Santamans was the director. Thereafter, in 2022, Grace Perez Navarro had this role temporarily and was recently replaced by Manal Corbin, former US tax advisor and US tax administration representative. At the time that Pascal Santamans was the director, the BEPS project, BEPS action, and the proposal for Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 were developed and discussed. There was a clear movement of the OECD towards inviting countries to participate as BEPS associate in the BEPS Inclusive Framework, as well as to commit to Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 OECD Secretariat proposal. Since then, there have been a lot of consultations that will take me at least 2 weeks to discuss these consultations, so we are not going to do it here. So during that time, civil society, country civil society, and some regional tax organizations called for a more decisive role of the United Nations. One of the main reasons is the broader representation of the countries in the United Nations, vis-à-vis the limited membership of the OECD. Countries were invited to become members only on the OECD based on the accession procedure. However, times have changed. Since Nigeria, with the support of some African countries, and Colombia, currently an OECD member country, that took part in the BEPS decision-making process as OECD accession country, have also questioned whether there is a fair global tax deal that benefits not only developed but developing countries. I am skeptical about the role of the UN. In my view, for the UN to have a leading role, there should be a coordination between all units, UNDESA, UNDP, UN Tax Committee, and this requires political will of countries and of the United Nations, of the UN institutions. In my view, the OECD, but also any organization, body such as the UN or an independent global tax body, will require throughput legitimacy. Agenda setting and decision-making should be transparent. Furthermore, this body should be held accountable for the decisions taken. The process should be also open to all stakeholders and responsive to the needs of all countries. What is next? When I started to discuss global tax governance, the BEPS project just started. 8 years later, we also have Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, as well as the recent developments that have taken place at the UN level. Moreover, on 15th of June, 2 weeks ago, the European Parliament, in a resolution on lessons learned from the Pandora Papers and other revelations, called for the EU to support the UN Convention, as well as to give an equal voice to developing countries. But, as I explained before, we have this standard of EU tax good governance, where the countries, non-European countries, are required to commit, because they need to receive EU aid, and to participate in the trade partnership agreements. So, in light of the standard of tax good governance that I have mentioned above, my question is this true? Can developing countries negotiate as equals, since non-EU countries, including developing countries, are required to implement BEPS and receive a positive review? To conclude, despite the funding of the GlobalTaxGov ERC project coming to an end by 31st of July this year, I will continue addressing these questions in my chair on tax governance at Leiden University and my AU Jamonet chair on EU tax governance. In my work, I aim to expand my research agenda to inquire under what conditions can the role of the United Nations in international tax lawmaking be legitimate and feasible for developed and developing countries. This shows that there is still work to be done, and that even though we started with global tax governance addressing issues of legitimacy and feasibility, after 8 years we have more actors: AU, OECD, UN, regional tax organizations, countries, civil society, business, think tanks, etc. And reconciling these goals is so difficult because it will be a difficult tax because countries need to benefit, developed and developing countries. We have organized several conferences online and on-site, and seminars where we provide a space for dialogue on topics of global tax governance. Most of these seminars have been recorded with recordings and slides made available open access. I will continue using this research and this network in my GlobalTaxGov, AU TaxGov, and in Leiden University to reach out to developing countries, civil society, regional tax organizations, and scholars in developed and developing countries. What I have learned since 2018, when I started with my GlobalTaxGov project, is that the questions of legitimacy, inclusiveness, continue being relevant for all stakeholders, and that any process of international tax lawmaking will need to analyze the conditions under which this process can be legitimate and feasible for developed and developing countries. This is true in the BEPS project, but also in the current developments of Pillar 1, Pillar 2, and the UN tax resolution. We cannot forget the process. So therefore, more attention should be given to transparency, accountability, responsiveness, and openness. And now, the acknowledgments. Dankwoord. Being where I am today, a full professor at Leiden Law School, in a university with more than 445 years of age, and on a topic that I'm passionate about, tax governance, has not been easy. As Machado says, caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar. Traveler, there is no road, the road is your traveling. I will not have been able to walk this road without support of my family in Colombia, my children, Pim, my ex-husband, my former colleagues at Groningen University, Utrecht University, the Hague University of Applied Science, Erasmus, Hamilton van der Toren, IBFD, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Some of them became my friends. To Irene Burgers, my PhD supervisor and friend, thank you for accepting to supervise me and for giving me the opportunity to learn from you as a person, mother, scholar, PhD supervisor. Because of you, I got into academia, so thank you. Special mention to my students in all places, where I have worked as a lecturer, and to the PhDs that I currently supervise, Frederick, Juliana, Eski, Kyunfan, and Anna, and the PhD that I have supervised in the past, Germaine. To Madeleine Hosley, thank you for agreeing to supervise Frederick and Juliana. From my family, I have learned that you need to work hard to achieve your dreams, but without hurting anyone or taking any credit for things that you have not done. Being with my sister, the first two in the family to receive university education, and now being here as a professor outside my country of origin, Colombia, has not been easy. There have been a lot of obstacles that I have found in my path, personally, but also professionally. However, in my view, we need to have perseverance if we want to achieve our goals. I have been rejected 3 times for a Benny, 1 for a Marie Curie, but then I managed to get an ERC grant, the first in taxation. And an AU Jamonet chair, the only one in the Netherlands at this moment in taxation. I have dreamed big, and I have been able to achieve my dreams. Even though I did the work, trying to write an ERC proposal in 6 weeks while having 2 jobs and 2 small children, I will not be here at Leiden University giving this inaugural lecture without Joanna van der Leun and Karel Stoker, who believed in me and made possible for me to come to Leiden Law School with my grant and to become a professor by agreeing on a tenure track. Dear Joanna and Karel, thank you for always supporting and believing in me. Thanks to you, Joanna, I'm the first Latin American professor at Leiden Law School, so thank you. You made this possible. When I started at the tax law department, I got the support of Gosboer, at that time head of the department, and of Koen Caminada, at that time institute director. You both made possible that I could work in the best conditions possible, and I could carry out my ERC Global Tax Gov research activities. In a project, the financing part is as important as the research. And for this, I have always had the support of the finance department, special mention to Jab, Eric, and Mirja, who have been facilitating all the financial reporting activities of the ERC Global Tax Gov project. There are more people involved from marketing, communications, human resources, and my colleagues at the tax law department and at the Institute of Tax Law and Economics. Especially, I have some power girls at the tax law department. Tirsa, Judith, Esther, Elodie, some of my power girls. Of course, there are more, but I wanted to mention you. I would like to express my gratitude to my dearest Ria. She was my former colleague at the tax law department. Where is Ria? Oh, sorry. Dear Ria, you have retired and you are enjoying your time with Peter, but you have been a true support and a friend at the department. Thank you. Also, thank you to my colleagues at the Mayor's Graduate School who have helped me in my capacity as PhD Dean. Thank you, Belinda, for helping me with the preparation of this inaugural lecture. Thank you, Ton, Annie, Stefan, for your support and advice. From my colleagues who became friends, I'm grateful to have extraordinary women. Irene, Jan, Sigrid, Diana, Anna, Berna, Alison, Janemiek, Chao, you truly inspire me. Also friends I have made during my work, Hans, Craig, Pasquale, Edward, Ricardo, Caterine, Axel, Aurelien, Michael, sorry, this is very Latino, Peter Hungler, Jan van den Toren, Monique, Servas, Vanessa, Brian, and so many more, thank you. To my friends who are also here, Patricia, Isabel, Jose, Rosario, Arman, Paulina, Sonia, Edilberto, Lida, Leticia, thank you. To my friends in Colombia and my family in Madrid, the family Ruiz Astride, but also to my friends in Colombia, thank you. But to all the amazing friends that I have made in all continents, among them, Marta, Julian, Gabriela, Suranjali, Andrea, Laura, Annalena, Gonzalo, Philip, Laila, Afton, Karen, Diane, Steve, Rifat, Sunita, and so many more, thank you. Some of you are here today, the row 3, 4, and 5, no, 4, 5, and 6, because of the Lawrence Center workshop that we have organized this week on the topic of redefining global governance, a tax, trade, and investment perspective in the EU and beyond. Thank you, Marga, who has been helping me with my children since they were born and making my children so happy that I could travel and keep carrying my work. And to Pavlina and Asi, who have shown me what hard-working women could achieve and have helped me with my house while I keep doing my work. Bedankt, Marga, Pavlina, and Asi. I could not be the person professional that I am today without my father, mother, and sister. Papá, gracias para mi mamá, para mi hermana, y para mis 3 sobrinos, Sara, Juan Andrés y Ángel Rodrigo. Voor mijn kinderen. Jullie zijn mijn leven. Ik zou hier niet zijn zonder jullie. Ik hou zoveel van jullie. Los amo mucho. Ik heb gezegd.